Well, Mr. Greg Parks of UFL board. I would argue outside of me, you are probably the best looking guy in this
Oh
space.
gosh.
Yeah. See the pre-show didn't have that compliment coming in there. But Mr.
I,
Greg,
I,
how are
I
you?
I'm doing well. I was not expecting that. That's I've never started off a podcast that way. That's the first for me. Thank you,
Well,
Pat.
I mean, the last time I think I've only uploaded maybe one video between my work and coaching and everything like that. I've been a little busy. Crazy
Mhm,
stuff. The UFL does not pay the bills around here. I'm very grateful for the people that always come in, and I'm very grateful for
mhm.
the people that comment and the people like you and I, how we've met and whatnot. But it doesn't always pay the bills. But what this does pay the bills is being a professional football player, and that's what
Yes.
we're going to talk about today. Now, just
Great
off the cuff,
segue.
yeah, great. I'm getting better. But off the cuff, Greg,
hmm
in 2024, the year of our Lord,
hmm
has it been a successful signing cycle for spring football as we're 4 weeks done with the NFL season?
I think there's a couple ways you can look at it. The first way you can look at it is 100% more players made the opening day rosters of NFL teams in 2024 after the UFL season than did after the 2023 XFL season, because they had two make rosters, initial rosters, whereas only one made it the year before. So I guess if you want to look at it percentage wise, yeah, pretty successful.
I'm a
But
percentage guy.
when you're hyping up the league the way that leadership did and saying, this is combining the best of the USFL, the best of the XFL, and spring football has never been this strong. The focus being on the on-field product and all of that kind of stuff. It does seem a little disappointing, and I think it does show the ceiling for these leagues. Even with a league like the UFL, which I think anyone who pays very close attention to spring leagues will tell you that in 2024, the quality of play for the UFL was so much higher than it was for the USFL and for the XFL the previous season. And yet, you still only saw a small handful of players make 53-man rosters. One of them was a kicker. I'm not sure if we want to count that or not. Kickers are people too, but I know there's people who don't look at that and think much of it. I think it's just the reality is it's very difficult for spring football players who've already been cycled out of the NFL ecosystem to get their foot back in the door. They can get their foot back in the door as a depth player on a training camp roster. We've seen, what was the number? 70, 80, 85 UFL
Well, we
players
don't we
signed.
don't know the numbers because some days they count Ramiz Ahmad, some days
Yeah,
they count Matt Landers, some days they're counting, you know, Demetric Felton, guys who signed
right.
like, oh, if it wasn't for us making this tweet, this guy doesn't come back. It's like, okay, guy,
So
who
we
played in
know
the
the
game?
general, yeah,
Yes,
we know the
yes.
general idea of the
I
number
got
of players who
74.
signed.
I
Okay,
got
sounds good to me.
74.
Let's
Yeah,
go with that. Let's go with 74. A good number. I mean, that's a
I
good
agree.
number. And then when you break it down further to the players who got opportunities in tryouts and things like that, it's an even bigger number. But I think it
Yes.
just goes to show how difficult it is once you've cycled out of that NFL ecosystem to break back in and get noticed in training camp, because training camps today are not like they were 20 years ago, where you had two-a-days and you had pads multiple times a week and you could really make an impression as a depth guy on coaches. And we have one fewer preseason game to be able to do that as well. So the odds are really stacked against these UFL players. um, to make an opening day roster. We've seen a lot make practice squads and get elevated to game day. So I'm not sure that answered your question, Pat, but I think everybody from fans to players to coaches to UFL management would like to see more, would like to see those numbers higher.
And I 100% agree. And it really comes. I love the fact that you put it in a perspective, right? In a percentage, because what is the saying? Numbers don't lie, liars figure, whatever, figures don't lie,
Mhm.
liars figure. I can
Yep.
spin anything to make it
Mhm.
a success. And we're probably, and Greg, I'll probably have you on in a couple weeks as we get really hard charging about this. But right now, I have a spreadsheet that I'm not going to show that I'm working on currently, and it is a games played, income earned for each USFL and XFL team. And I'm even going back to 2020 to see like what is the true financial success, because
Mhm.
that's how I gauge the success, right? And something that, and while money's not everything, at the same time, the love of the game, this game takes a vicious beating on your body. There's no doubt about it. This is a violent game. It's the closest thing we have to get gladiators outside of the UFC and more official combat sports. But we are watching, young men go out there to entertain us, right? And for
Mhm.
me, a guy like Cavante Turpin, who was an afterthought, whether it be maybe the situation it wasn't as transparent as it should have been, the fact that he is now going into his third year in the NFL,
Mhm.
coming up, and I think his career earnings are about like 2.6, $2.7 million. He's a millionaire. He's paying Texas
Mhm.
state tax, which is zero. Yeah, there's that 3% fee, but this is a guy who might have been, not doing so hot if it wasn't for the USFL back in 2022.
Yeah.
So that's like the impact changed, the families changed, all that good stuff. And I don't know if we talked about it, Greg. I know I've talked about it with other people. Is like once you hit that $10 million in earnings, you got to give a kickback to that league somehow, man.
Yeah, I
And
remember I remember you having that idea, and I think
I
it's
mean, that's
smart to
the only way.
and not yeah, not
Like
enough
I hate
people
saying,
frame it in the financials because that's really, I mean, that's really what the players focus on. Yeah, a lot of them will play for the love of the game, but if you're the UFL and you can show prospective players, hey, uh, we've graduated so many players to the NFL and
yes,
they've made X amount of dollars, take a chance on us and you could be one of those players as well. That's a powerful argument that these leagues can make.
you're seeing on average, because I did it for 2022. Their peak was 28 players on NFL practice squads or rosters with the USFL, and collectively those guys earned about $8 million. 2023, I think it got up to like 40 at some point, like between the two leagues. They
Mhm.
made about $9 million, and that's including 2022 guys. This year, I don't have those numbers yet. I will do that, but I mean, yeah, you might get your Josh Hawkins, you might get a lot of guys who are just like in the love of the game and all that stuff. But in the end, man, it's like, why was DeAndre Francois in this league? It was to get to the NFL. Teamu,
Mhm.
NFL. Luis Perez, NFL. Like, that's the goal, man. And until they start paying these guys some of the Vince McMahon money, it's the reality of this situation. But while we will dive down that rabbit hole, biggest disappointment for me this year, only two guys that have actually off the street signed to NFL squads, and they are Jalen Dalton and Matt McCrane. Who Dalton is still on an NFL practice squad roster with the Cowboys. They love the Cowboys, and McCrane, which Bates was never on the injury report. He's he's obviously off and he's re-signed with DC, which is great. I mean, but at this point, like Matt McCrane is kind of a 2 week kicker guy. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But those are the only two guys, and that gets you up to 74. So what do you think about
Mhm.
that, Greg?
Yeah, I think that you're going to have these guys, and you're seeing them come in. Matthew McCrane, you're going to see, especially with the specialists, right? They're going to sign to the practice squad. We've seen Tucker Addington on and off practice
Which
squads
we'll
all
talk
year.
about Tucker later, because there's a little bit of lore to the Dolphins Dolphins situation, but continue, please.
Yeah,
Sorry to
I
cut
know
you off.
you. I know you posted about that on social media, and I wrote about that in my one of my write-ups for UFLboard.com, trying to
Yes.
figure out what the Dolphins were doing. I think we both came to the same conclusion on that. But yeah, it's you're going to see these guys come in. They're going to try out. You're going to have maybe quarterbacks too, especially later in the season. We're up to I think week 15 now of the
Yep.
NFL season. So the last couple of weeks, it's really going to be desperation time for these teams. And these are the kind of guys they're going to be looking at to fill a practice squad role if somebody gets hurt and it appears on the injury report or something like that. So, these are probably not guys who are going to get signed to futures contracts after the season. So they'll still be available to sign with the UFL afterward or join the UFL. Yeah, it's getting to be that time of year where guys like this are going to get workouts more and more often, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, like I said, man, slightly disappointing to see that number only really be 2. Because last year I think it was like 10. You had Ginda getting picked up for a couple weeks.
Mhm,
Obviously, AJ was a mid-year signing. Reed Sinet, Drew Plitt, all guys after the training camp.
mhm.
I'm a big Reed Sinet homer over here, so anytime I see his name, but just slightly disappointing. But on the bright side, those who stay will be champions. No doubt about that, right? And the first guy
Yeah.
I want to talk about, the prodigal son himself, 21 of 22, 2 game winning field goals, has made 2 tackles, 48 of 49, looking like a Pro Bowler this year. Doesn't get much
Yeah,
better
and
than that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's really surprising, not necessarily that he's been successful, but just the consistency. That was never his strong suit. Obviously, he's very new to field goal kicking, but
Yes.
even when he was with the Panthers this year, I mean, he was known for his leg kicking 50 and 60-yard field goals. It wasn't the consistency that he was known for. And even in training camp with Detroit, there were times where he struggled with consistency. He'd have a really good
Yes.
day, he'd have a really bad day in training camp, and you were wondering if Detroit was going to take that step to bring in competition for him because for much of training camp, he didn't have competition. So they let him figure it out himself. And so to see the success he's having has been awesome, if not a little surprising.
Yeah, and even when Michigan brought him in, I was like, not that I thought Cole Murphy was, you know, the next Brandon Aubrey, but Cole had been serviceable for 2 years.
Mhm.
And in a 16-team spring football league, Cole deserved one of those jobs. And Jake has made everyone eat crow.
Mhm.
He's obviously in line to be a Pro Bowler. Obviously Pro Bowl is a little bit of a popularity contest, but in the end, like no one, you know, between the goalposts, like says it. It's like if anyone said that Jake Bates was the guy going into the 2024 UFL season and
Mhm.
then into the 2024 NFL season, I'll just call you a liar straight up. But you got to be happy for Jake, man. It's good for the
Yeah.
brand. And Michigan Panthers always just win, lose or draw. Always a team that's putting guys out into the league and putting them in good places. This next guy, DeAndre Tillman, starting to work
Mhm.
into the rotation. What do you think about that? D2 guy, best thing about him, 3 years with the Birmingham Stallions, winning
Yeah. That's really cool.
championships. Yeah, I mean, this is grind, 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 grind. And
Mhm.
obviously we've seen the fruits of his labor pay off. Now on the active roster, um, 14 tackles, and it looks like he's working his way into a more consistent rotation right now, kind of taking that mold of Jeremiah Farms.
Mhm. It's one thing to be kind of a mercenary and come into the UFL for a year and then go back to the NFL. But for somebody like this, I mean, this is the kind of guy you really want to spotlight if you're the UFL. Here's a guy who spent 3 years in spring football, finally got an opportunity on the 53-man roster and really taking advantage of it. You mentioned working his way more into the rotation. I know they've had some injuries at the linebacker spot. Baron Browning has been in and out of the lineup, and that's afforded Tillman some time off the edge. And when you watch him on TV, I mean, he's a big dude, like, and he's fast. He stands out when he's rushing off the edge, just his body type. So it's not too surprising that he's been successful, but it's again, I mean, this is the kind of guy, yeah, we like Jake Bates and we like what he stands for and things like that. But I mean, if you really want to hold spring football up as a success story, I think Dondre Tillman is one of the guys you do that with.
Yeah, and I have been on record saying this multiple times. It's always the defensive lineman. I know we're seeing Terp right now kind of mold into it more, and we'll talk about Terp in a little bit, but like these defensive linemen for the last 4 years, or excuse me,
Mhm.
going on 4 years, have consistently put up good numbers and been a part of rotations. And some of them are really fighting to be starters now. And to me, it's a great thing to see. And as a defensive line guy, like obvious bias here, very pumped about it. Another
Yeah.
defensive lineman, Jalen Redmond, got a little scared, knocked off the roster, practice squad, really made his presence known. 13 tackles, a sack in 8 games, 6 TFLs. Um, I would say that Minnesota, not as much as Detroit, has been kind of played around with the injury bug. But Redmond looks like he is setting himself up to make a decent amount of money in this league, at least for the next 3 years.
Boy, has he been coming on strong the last few weeks. He's had
Yes.
a really great last few weeks. Started last week, actually, was in the
Yep.
starting lineup, knocked down 2 passes.
Hmm.
So it's just been really cool to see, as you said, at the beginning of the year, he's kind of on and off the practice squad, cut from the 53 man, elevated for game day, get a handful of snaps here and there. But to see him actually produce at a high level the last 2 weeks to the point where he was, I think 2 weeks ago, given the game ball by head coach
Yes.
Kevin O'Connell after the game in the locker room. And then he gets the start this week. Brian Flores in his press conference speaks very highly of Redmond, the defensive coordinator, Brian Flores. So, I mean, you're seeing these guys get some momentum, get some wind at their back, like Jalen Redmond. And who knows where it's going to end up, whether he's going to finish out the year strong, whether it's just kind of a couple week flash for a guy. But it's really exciting to see.
Oh, it's to me one of the better, like him, Tillman. These are the guys he won a champion. I know we're very high
Mhm.
on Jake Bates, but this is a guy to me that you want a champion and be like, hey man, like he's not a quarterback, he's not this, all the
Yeah.
stereotypical hard work stuff, like the lunch pail guy, all that stuff. Like
Yeah.
this is the dude doing it right now, man.
Mhm.
Now this is a good story, and he's not going to put up the stats, but to see a guy like Rex Sonahara just have the taste last year, the comeback in a what's the best term to call that Brahmas team, in a sporadic Brahmas team, for him to go out there and finally make his NFL debut. And there's only 32 of them, and they needed some help. But
Yeah.
Sonahara going out there, I haven't seen a botch snap yet. I've watched a lot of the Browns games specifically for him. It doesn't get much better than that, right?
And it's a great story because Sunahara is a local guy, a
Yep.
product of the Cleveland area, and he snapped in training camp when Charlie Huglet was injured, and so Huglet gets injured in the regular season, and they call upon Sunahara to replace him. And he's snapped in, as you mentioned, 8 games, so he's not going to be the permanent guy, probably. He's one of those guys that I mentioned earlier, that especially the specialists, they're going to get brought in. They're going to be replacements. I'm sure we'll talk about his former battery mate with the San Antonio Brahmas, John Parker Romo, a little later on.
Yep.
But these are guys who these are valuable reps. They're putting work on tape just like they did in the UFL. And the work that Romo put in, even though he was a 3 or 4 week stint with the Vikings, that earned him signing with the New England Patriots practice squad, and he could be kicking this week for them. So that's important game tape to put together and important performances to put together. You're not just doing it for the team you're on, you're doing it for all the other NFL teams who may be looking for someone at that position at some point.
100%. And I mean, the guy's slated to earn about 600K this year. I mean,
Mm,
I hate bringing it back to the money. I'm a business guy at heart, but I mean, regardless of if it's a great economy or a terrible economy, 600K is a good number to have in any economy. So the
yeah.
fact that it takes pressure off him, in my opinion,
Hmm.
to continue to go out and have good games, because now if he comes back, he does the training camp, it extends his life in his football life, to where
Hmm.
even if he goes with the Browns again on a futures deal, 1 year deal, goes into camp, gets cut. A lot of these guys don't live extravagant lifestyles. You know what I mean? Like they might
Right.
take a trip down to Mexico now, but like it doesn't put the pressure on him to come back into the spring, play for San
Mhm.
Antonio, get hurt, and then he can't go snap for 9 games
Yeah.
in the UFL. And I don't think a lot of people talk about that. And to me, it's a big deal that these guys have options when before they
Mhm.
might have not had them. And that's, the
Yeah.
best place to life is in life is to have leverage. This is I like this one. And even though your time was short, you're still an NFL player now. Alec Lindstrom of the New York Jets helping out on the field goal unit for one game, on and off. I suspect he'll be back in the spring once more, but he did it. He is the first Memphis Showboat or Tampa Bay Bandit to be of the modern era to appear in a game. So big
Mm.
props to him. Bounced around a little bit, but he did it. Something I haven't done. What do you think? What do you think we see? You think Alex has that win for 2024 spring now?
Yeah, I think that's a great stat too to bring up, that the first Memphis Showboat to play in an NFL game of the modern era. So that's really cool. I wouldn't be surprised. I know we've only got a few weeks left, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up back on the Jets practice squad at some point this year. He's been signed and cut and re-signed about 2 or 3 times, so still time for that to happen. But I think the one thing that's going to be interesting is Memphis with the new coaching staff. What are they looking for in their offensive linemen? Does Alec Lindstrom fit what they're looking for as an offensive lineman? And if not, does he go to another team in the spring of 2025? So I really liked him, and I really liked that signing by the Showboats last year. I know their offensive line was one of the many weak parts of the team, but it was great to see him get this opportunity in the NFL and take advantage of it.
And it wasn't Lindstrom. Lindstrom was about the only one that I'd have out
Yeah.
there. Everyone
Yeah.
else, I mean, they obviously will talk about it probably as the season gets closer, but new look Memphis Showboats, along
Hmm.
with the new look Houston Roughnecks. Another good one here, a true wide receiver, Kevin Austin from the Birmingham Stallions. 7
Yeah.
receptions so far, 90 yards, 1 rush, 19 yards. Now on the Saints active roster.
Yeah.
Greg, and we got 4 more games in this season. Jake Hayner is now the quarterback.
Yeah.
Who did he throw to in camp? Kevin Austin. We could see
Hmm.
a Kevin Austin. He could put a 7 for 90 up. Someone he's
And this isn't
confident
a,
with.
yeah, this isn't a guy who's just playing special teams and getting a handful of snaps on
He's not
offense.
playing a lot of special teams, Craig. He really isn't.
Right.
He is
No,
wide receiver 3.5.
that's what I'm saying. And he's often getting the second most snaps among Saints wide receivers, which tells
Yeah.
you the injuries they've suffered at that position. So he's a guy who's playing a lot, saw 5 targets the last game. And so I think down the stretch, and you made a great point about Jake Hayner, backup, who's going to probably finish out the season now. And, in training camp, when you're on the backup team, the 2s and 3s, you're throwing to other 2s and 3s. And that's where Kevin Austin was too. So there may be a little chemistry there from training camp, and we'll see if that plays out in the games in the last few weeks.
He could be the outside of Turpin. He'll be the first one with over 100 yards in the modern era.
Mm,
So
wow.
yeah. It's sad but awesome all at the same time, right? We'll get down
I
to
mean, it is great to celebrate these milestones, but you're right. It's like, really, that's only 2. I mean,
yeah.
that just, it seems sad in some ways.
Well, here's who's left. Deshaun White, linebacker from Michigan, Brandon Smith, DC defender, Jalen Dalton, Nate Brooks. This is Adrian Martinez, and I'm pointing at my screen like you could see me pointing. But Adrian Martinez, when the Aaron Rodgers conversations were happening, I did think Week 18 could have been a Martinez read option game, making him the
Yeah.
first quarterback in the 2022 era present to make an appearance. Garvin's a guy I think can get a late elevation, Coliavo as well, but Martinez has been elevated. So guys
Mm-hmm.
are making a little bit of money. Guys are staying employed. It's a lot of good stuff.
Mm-hmm. The 2 offensive linemen, Cole Livau and Liam Fornadel, are interesting because they haven't been elevated once this year. And both of those teams have suffered some really significant offensive line injuries throughout the year.
Yes.
So it's almost like they're taking a redshirt year, right? They're in
Yes.
an NFL camp for the first time. They're going through the rigors of an NFL season for the first time. These are kind of guys you stash, and that's originally what the practice squad was for. And now you got all these kind of veterans who are on practice squads because they've ballooned the number of practice squad spots up. But I mean, these are the guys who, really what the practice squad is for, to develop them throughout the season, bring them to camp next year, see how far they've come from one year to the next. So not so much this year and not so much, the last couple of weeks, we talk a lot about, maybe this guy will get elevated, maybe this guy will get elevated. For these offensive linemen, it's not about that. It's about next year. And when they
Yeah.
come to training camp, if they sign futures deals, and just what kind of jump they make from year one in the NFL to year two.
Yeah, you got to think with Liavo, with Lindstrom getting signed off the street, spending a week there, and then getting elevated. You got to think that they are kind of not ready for Liavo in that
Mm-hmm.
sense. But overall, you have to think a lot of these guys are kind of cannibalizing each other. So the fact that you still got a bunch of these dudes making their NFL debuts, along with what is that, about 9 of them, 8 of them on the practice squad still.
Mm-hmm.
I consider that a win, making some
Yeah.
generational wealth here. As we go into the 2023 USFL class, kind of sad. It condenses a little bit, but Brandon Aubrey's still the guy.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, you look at the background of the two most successful kickers to come out of spring football. It's Jake Bates, who did not kick field goals in college, and Brandon Aubrey, who comes from a soccer background. So they're non-traditional kickers who don't have that history in college. Just kind of funny how that worked out.
Oh, 100%. And we know what Brandon Aubrey's done, two-time USFL champion, out of nowhere. Originally born in St. Louis, but came out of Dallas. Seeing him still involved last year, by the way, was great.
Hmm.
I believe he was at the opener. Now still in Dallas, and I mean, outside of Bates, this guy. I mean, it's 1A or 1B for that Pro Bowl vote. So
Hmm.
either or, spring football is going to make an impact in the Pro Bowl as well. This is a guy that kind of, to me, is on the way out. And I hate saying this, but Khalil Davis going now with, now with San Francisco. I wrote Cincinnati. I was confused with Carlos. But this is a guy last year that really popped. I think he finished up with like 30 something tackles and whatnot, maybe a sack and a half. And then now kind of more in that rotational role. Still in the NFL, still getting paid, but Khalil's a guy that I thought would take the next level, kind of dominate a little bit, be more consistent in that rotation, to now he's kind of, especially with the 49ers having all those injuries, not really doing too much.
Yeah, he was a guy who was really hurt by a trade. I mean, he started the year with the Houston Texans. Trade deadline comes, gets sent to San Francisco, and really hasn't played much for them. Has been inactive for a couple of games, so doesn't even dress on game day. And he's a guy who I thought had a pretty strong preseason, and
Mhm.
didn't really get the opportunities maybe I thought he would in Houston. Then get shipped off to San Francisco. It feels like kind of an afterthought. So you're right. It does feel like the writing is kind of on the wall for him in terms of his NFL future.
Definitely a guy I see in camp next year with
Hmm.
any of these teams. Doesn't stick, finds his way back to the UFL for one more go around. Kansas City guy really liked his brother Carlos. I thought Carlos was going to stick.
Yep.
That was my that was one of my guarantees of 2024 camp. Speaking of
Oh,
popping
okay.
though, LeBron Ray
Ugh.
figuring
Wow.
it out. This guy
Yeah.
th- making some money right now.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you don't think of defensive linemen as getting a lot of tackles, right? They're eating up blocks and they're letting the linebackers do their thing, especially in Carolina's defense. And so for him to, every week it's like 4 tackles, 5 tackles, 3 tackles,
Yep.
4 tackles. It's like that's a lot for a defensive lineman. I don't think people understand that is very active for especially, I mean, more of an interior defensive lineman. He's not really rushing off the edge. He's got a
Nope.
big uh, his hand is injured, so he's got a big pad on his hand that he has to wear, which can only make tackling more difficult, and he's still getting the job done. So, if Khalil Davis has been a disappointment this year, I think LeBron Ray has been one of the more pleasant surprises and was worked his way into the starting lineup in Carolina.
He's doing a real good job in that 4-eye right now. And if you don't know what a 4-eye is, those who's listening, that's when they are on the inside of the tackle. That would be what they call the 4-eye technique. And he, to me, is becoming a lot more involved in their game plan. And with him being a younger guy, because he was a class of 2023 guy when he went with the Stars. Once again, this is a guy that the UFL does not talk about nearly enough. I mean, this guy could finish the year with 50 tackles as a defensive lineman. That's an impressive stat. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big stat guy, big money guy, all that good stuff. But what I'll be really impressed with is if he puts together another decent season like this in 25, like this dude's gonna ink himself a 2-year, 3-year deal, making some good
Yeah.
money, and he's gonna hit some milestones. And the UFL, USFL, XFL, I don't think they've had any guys hit that 10 sack milestone, or excuse me, 10 sack, 100 tackle career milestone. And someone that gets lost in the spring football lore of this is always Mike Purcell from
Mm.
the Salt Lake Stallions. Granted, he had some years in the NFL before that, but that guy played another 7 years because of the
Yeah.
Stallions, and that's a guy who made it himself at like $14 million after his
Wow.
tenure in the and yeah, it's a crazy thing. But much love to LeBron, man. That's a guy that did not get talked about enough, kind of an afterthought. He was a late signing with the Stars, played a couple games, and he's out there crushing it, man. And he's going
Hmm.
to be a success story. And much love to him and his family. I love this one. If we talk about success stories, I put this little note in there. Um, the only USFL running back to have a carry.
Yeah.
It's once again, you hear that, you're pumped, but you're like, man, what's this
Yeah.
ROI? Champ bet on himself, did not opt to come back, went with the futures contract, landed on the practice squad, played in 3 games, had some carries, had some return yards when I forget who the backup is in Philly or in Pittsburgh is, but Champ kind of brought it together, and I think he keeps himself around in the conversation for at least another opportunity in 2025.
Yeah, I think it was Jalen Warren who was banged
Yes,
up
yes,
when they
yep.
called Shamklin up, and he had been on same thing, called up from the practice squad, elevated, signed to the 53-man roster. Pittsburgh's really recycled their running backs off the practice squad this year. They've had Jonathan Ward on there, they've had Aaron Shamklin on there, they've had I think another guy who's been on and off 2 or 3 times. So the running back position is something they're constantly running through on the practice squad, but yeah, it's been really cool to see him. He's gotten some really good opportunities in the return game, especially special teams, which is where you see these kind of guys. But running back is one of those positions. It's just you take such a beating when you play running back. Running backs more than maybe any other position except maybe quarterback really have to do that calculus in their mind. Okay, if I go to the UFL and I play 10 games and I take all these hits and my body takes a beating, is it worth it, to potentially get back to the NFL? Or are they just going to see that as, because you always hear that about college players coming out of college, right? Well, they look at how many carries they've got, how many miles are on their body already, right? And that's a consideration that scouts take into account when they draft running backs. And so I think you're not seeing often, although we saw a little bit more this past year, you're not seeing those top level free agent running backs come in to spring football as much as you're seeing, say, defensive linemen or defensive backs or wide receivers.
It's a damn shame because there's a lot of these guys out there who could possibly um, make that transition. And I was pretty high up on Philip Lindsay last year, being kind of
Yeah.
a mid year signing, and the reason why is because he did come in the middle of the season, and because he did that, I felt like he saved himself some miles.
Hmm.
Um, Come in, okay, yeah, he still has it. Let's move on with our day type thing. Like he just had to prove just enough. Would Champ being a little bit like lower on the tier of like not really being in camp recently, and he
Hmm.
might have saved himself some miles, but yeah, I do think he's done enough to come back into 2025. A sad story here, a happy but
Yeah.
sad story. Josh Butler, guy made himself some money though. I will say that.
Hmm.
If
Yeah.
not if not
Think
on the field, in his social media presence.
Thanksgiving Day, man, what a brutal blow for him, tearing an ACL just as he worked his way into the starting lineup. Dallas has had a lot of injuries in the defensive backfield. Butler goes from being on the practice squad to being on the 53-man roster and into the starting lineup, and makes a lot of tackles and knocks down a couple passes. And he's a guy that when he takes the field, the other team's going to be aiming for him because he's just called up off the practice squad. So he was able to start, I think, 2 games before he tore the ACL. So hopefully he's able to come back. Tearing the ACL this late in the season, it's going to be a late start to training camp next year if he makes it back for that. So that puts him in a rough position there as well, unfortunately.
It does, but you have to think like especially with a regime change and everything like that might hurt him. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think he's done enough, and with the rehab
You're,
process
you're
and everything
sending
like
Mike
that,
McCarthy out the door already, huh?
yeah, I have to. Man, I'm gonna be honest. Trade Dak to Tennessee, Shadur and Prime.
Oh boy,
That's yeah. I
can
mean, I
you
don't know if it
imagine?
works
Wow.
out, but it'll get people buying tickets. I'll tell you that
Uh
much.
huh.
But yeah, that's a guy, man, that you're just happy he got on the field. He's
Yeah.
grinded on the practice squad for a year. Older guy, obviously. I think his only real opportunity was in the spring league. Didn't play in the 2022 USFL. Came out, put together a real solid performance in 2023 with the Michigan Panthers, especially with Levante Taylor being on the other side. And that guy was pretty close to being locked down. So Josh was a guy that had to prove himself. Great story. If you don't
Mm-hmm.
know, when he was at Michigan State, he had his dogs walk him out because unfortunately both his parents passed away while he was in college, and that's kind of how he made his brand and whatnot. But overall, it just seems like a generally great human being to
Mm-hmm.
exist in our space, and grateful he got to be. In the end of the day, Greg, he's an NFL football player, and he
Yeah,
did that.
exactly.
So not much going on who's left. Alex Magoo, uh, still grinding there, Back, had the workout with the Giants, got beat out by Tim Boyle, but the more I think about it, the more I think he said, "I'm good." Um,
Yeah.
and is now back with the Green Bay Packers as a practice squad wide receiver. And then DJ Montgomery is still on the Colts practice squad as well. And now they have Caden Davis back. He was recently
Mm-hmm.
signed with the Browns. So little three-peat, all guys that could receive an elevation. DJ had a lot of playing time last year. If they haven't cut him yet, I figure that that's a guy they probably bring back. Caden Davis seems like he'll be around the workout cycle for another year or two. Still a pretty young guy. And then Magoo, if it ain't going to happen this year, man, I don't know. I think a lot of people were championing him to come back to Birmingham, but those are your three
Yeah.
guys in the pipeline for the 2023 class that haven't made their debuts yet. Very efficient, this class.
Yeah, Magoo is the interesting one. Is he a quarterback? Is he a wide receiver? Would he have interest coming back to spring football to play quarterback? I don't know if he's a guy that Green Bay offers a futures contract to at the end of the season. I really don't. He had been through training camp with them as a wide receiver this year. Did they see enough to really? I mean, obviously they saw enough to sign him back to the practice squad, but uh, in season practice squad, you're not going to really have a lot of opportunities to show what you can do. So, do they think he's progressed enough to put him on the offseason roster, or do they let him go? And if they let him go, does he come back to the UFL? Does he come back as a quarterback or a wide receiver? That's a lot of stuff still up in the air for him. Birmingham still looking for a quarterback to replace Adrian Martinez. Matt Corral just got a workout yesterday, so he's still on the periphery of the NFL, hasn't re-signed with the UFL. So a lot of questions with Magoo.
I will say Alex Magoo did have 3 targets in 2022. That
Mm,
rhymed a little bit. But Alex Magoo does have experience playing wide receiver in the professional football game. I
yeah.
seen it. I seen it. Nothing too sexy on the 2023 XFL class. Daniel Whalen doing a good job punting, consistent. This one yesterday or 2 days ago, he got elevated. Um,
hmm
didn't play any snaps or anything like that. A little bit sad for him, but Chris Blair's still there. I believe he's had 3 or 2 elevations this year. He's appeared in 2 games in over the last 2 years. Um, he's a guy that I'm just like, hey man, you got to throw this dude the ball at some point to see if he's worth sticking around or whatnot, or
Yeah.
maybe he's not doing it in practice. But both him and Lucky Jackson are kind of, in my mind, like they're getting to that point where they need to go out on that field and play to see if
Hmm.
they can kind of piece together their career a little bit.
Yeah, Blair, that was his third elevation of the year this past Sunday. So Atlanta's going to have to figure out what they want to do with him going forward. And Lucky Jackson hasn't been elevated at all this year on the Minnesota Vikings practice squad all year. So he's making that practice squad money, but like you said, it's not a lot of uh, progress or production from him. So these guys have to decide, is it worth making this money and saying you're an NFL player, or do you want to get on the field and compete? Because
Yeah.
these guys just aren't getting that opportunity, unfortunately.
No, and it's kind of a struggle. It's kind of a struggle to see it, and like
Yeah.
if you're the DC Defenders, like, do you want to bring them back? It just comes down to what do the coaches of these leagues want to do? Do they want to win games? Do they want to develop? It's finding that sweet spot in between. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, we've had Lucky, we've had Chris. Let's see what John Smith from Slippery Rock can do. So
It's the
it's a
decision
very
Anthony Becht made with AJ McCarron.
yeah, I mean, he's done it not only with AJ, but a couple of them. They got
Hmm.
rid of Donnie Hakeman last year because he was too old, Trey Watson because he was too old. But then
Hmm.
they're also bringing guys back who are 30 plus. And so I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. CJ Brewer finally on the active roster, starting to pop
Hmm.
a little bit. Had a good two sack game, has cooled off, but Roughnecks never die. You know what I mean?
For sure. He's a guy who is another one of these interior defensive linemen who, when they get an opportunity, they tend to produce. So I think that's going to be really the story if you were to take a step back and look at the story of spring football players in the NFL in 2024. The story is going to be, the success of the kickers, the continued success of Brandon Aubrey, Jake Bates bursting on the scene, but also the success of these defensive linemen from Jalen Redmond to CJ Brewer to DeAndre Tillman and these guys. I think that's going to be a story that we're going to look back and say that kind of sums up the story of spring football players in the NFL in 2024.
100% agree. Bruce Hector, same thing we could say about him. Two elevations back on the or excuse me, three elevation. I think two elevations with an active roster signing. That's a guy who's kind of come through and whatnot. Really pumped about what he's done over the last 2 years. John Parker Romo. Oh, I did not edit the slide, but now with New England, 11
Yeah.
of 12 from field goals, 7 of 8. Um, that's another specialist as well. Those two guys making an impact, still being
Hmm.
on there. And I think Romo is this is a guy who bet on himself straight up.
Yep.
Nothing to talk about with that. Like,
Hmm.
decided not to go back to San Antonio, continue the workout cycle, was with Minnesota, I believe, in the preseason. And then, obviously Will Riker gets hurt and he comes in, does a bang up job, and he has found himself meaningful employment.
Yeah, he actually signed with Minnesota back in March, I believe, and then
Yeah.
they drafted Will Reichard and cut Romo, and then so
Okay.
Reichard gets hurt, as you mentioned. They bring Romo back, and this is really cool because he was on social media days before Minnesota signed him, basically talking himself into coming to the UFL this year. Like, I mean, he was that close to coming to the UFL, and then he gets signed by Minnesota, has a tremendous 4-game audition or whatever it was, and ends up now in New England. So it doesn't look like he's going to be available for the UFL in 2025, which is great for him.
Yeah. That's a guy that, once again, bet on himself. I'm better. I can do this, and then push on from there.
Hmm.
Five guys on the practice squad. Ben DiNucci, another dude who decided to, kind of keep on the path of the NFL. Jack Heflin, he was cut, I believe, by the Saints,
Yep.
um, and then comes back with the Rams. That's a guy who's kind of that 4A player to me, a guy who can probably stick in the NFL, but might be past his window. Michael Bandy is a guy that we've talked about for years. LaCale London, a little bit disappointment. Was really involved last year. This year has been kind of stowed away on the practice squad for Atlanta. And then we've talked about Lucky Jackson. So five guys still doing it. DiNucci probably be a guy that they continue to keep eyes on as far as on the spring football circuit, but I don't foresee him getting re-signed to a futures deal with the Saints. However, this might be a little breaking news. There's been DMs and text messages sent to him from a UFL franchise. Someone that
That doesn't surprise me.
yep,
That does not surprise me.
yep, from a fan base that he hurt in 2023. So you pick together what that means. But yeah, Danucci's on the radar and whatnot. So we'll see what happens with that. 2022 class, this Micah Abernathy going strong, 3 years. It's a XFL 2020 guy. Is on the IR now, but he was pretty much being a core 4 special teams guy on the IR. He's a guy that, we might, the chapter might be closing for him. Kind of really wasn't getting in the rotation, but a lot of special teams play for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunate that he got hurt because he was, as you mentioned, he wasn't getting time on defense, but certainly a guy who's seeing a lot of time on special teams, similar to Elijah Campbell, 2020 DC defender safety with the Miami Dolphins.
Yep. Another success story here, Mitch Fabroni. He's always a top guy with long snappers and tackles. This dude finds his way down there. I don't know, but he seems like he's secured himself a pretty good job in Denver. And then the golden child, Cavante Turpin, coming up on 1,500 all-purpose yards, really being used in the wide receiver game this year, probably making his way to a Pro Bowl, which is really big in his contract year. Going into next year, the age 29 season. And just, Brian Webster made a little comment here, and I want to give it a shout out. The Maulers and the Gamblers, they put guys in the NFL.
Yeah.
Just saying. But, Terp is obviously now that he's evolving more into the wide receiver position, that guy's, in my opinion, doing a pretty good job of keeping himself gainfully employed for 2025.
And it's crazy because you look at his numbers and you still ask yourself, why isn't he playing more on offense?
Yes.
And so it's an increase from last year, but we were asking ourselves the same thing last year. Here's a guy who's obviously dynamic, one of the top return men in the league. How is he not seeing more time? And they are doing it this year. They're playing him on gadget plays, giving him the ball to run with and doing reverses and things like that. So he's got a lot of carries. But he's a guy who you would think would be able to be more effective on offense and get more opportunities on offense than he's seen.
Could you give me, off the top of your head, percentage wise, what his offensive snaps are, if you had to guess?
Oh, I would say no more than 15 to 20 per game. And that's probably on the high end.
Yeah, it's 22 overall now, which obviously has increased over the last couple weeks. But I mean, Terp, with how dynamic he is, he's 4 games left. I think he's going to break 500 receiving yards. Like if they keep using him the way they're using him, and it's like he's going to be one of the top receivers in their squad, and he's only playing 20% of the snaps.
I know.
So it's a little disappointing, but I mean, the fact that this guy is going into this contract year, I said in the prior to the season, I was like, this guy needs to do more than just be a gadget return guy if he wants to make a long-term impact here. But it is good to see, and obviously he's making waves on it. Jeremiah Farms, we talked about, another Maulers guy, NAIA guy. Obviously solid there on the bye. 3rd season in New England. Made a little bit of an impact last year. This year, a little bit more in the rotation, starting some games. Tucker Addington, one of the weird stories of spring football. He is what I call the 34th best long snapper in this league. And for whatever reason, Miami does not want to commit to a long snapper. They're on their 4th one of the season. Zach Triner goes into his 3rd elevation coming up this week, and Addington now on Jacksonville's practice squad. Played in a game for New England, played in 4 games for Miami, or 3 games for Miami after replacing Matt Overton, who was a OG UFL guy. And just kind of glad to see, this Houston Gamblers legend continue to progress and be in the NFL.
Yeah, it's crazy what the Dolphins are doing. For those who don't know, like they don't have their long snapper got hurt, and rather than replace him on the 53-man roster, they're keeping a long snapper on the practice squad and elevating them for game day. So what that means is you can only be elevated 3 times in a season from the practice squad. So they'll elevate the long snapper 3 times and then release him, sign a new long snapper, elevate them 3 times, release them. And what it does is it saves them a roster spot on the 53-man roster. They can use that spot for someone else, because I think, at least to the naked eye, there's really not much of a difference between long snappers, right? Between the first and 34th long snapper in the league, or 35th or 36th, there's not a lot of difference. So Miami can get away with just keeping them on the practice squad and cycling through them, but it is certainly a strange situation.
Yeah, it's something I wouldn't do, but that's why they don't pay me the big bucks. So I'm very curious to see what they do with Triner after this week,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it is a little bit weird that they're doing this. I had to add this slide last second, but it was Maurice Alexander found himself Um, their primary punt returner, which is ironic because a couple years ago he was their kick returner, but he's been with Detroit for the last 2 years. Love to see him kind of get some more offensive opportunities. I think Tim Patrick is kind of pushing him away, but this
Mm-hmm.
is a guy that was pretty dynamic, had a really good USFL North Division Championship game, a very versatile guy, and obviously proving his worth over the last 3 years. Has appeared in 6 NFL games since his time with the Stars, and I think it's a feel good story. Love to see him do a little bit more on offense if he gets that opportunity, though.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, class of 22, that's really it. Honestly, obviously, Dominique Davis got elevated and then recently released. He was on Pittsburgh's practice squad. The class of 2020, very special, like similar names that you're seeing over the last about 5 seasons. Three prime lawn snappers, Nick Moore being an all pro. Parham hasn't really received the elevation. Michael Dunn, kind of a reserve guy. Elijah Campbell, the this special team specialist, kind of in the mold of Micah Abernathy. Taylor Heineke was the Chargers' leading rusher at halftime last week. He seems like he's pretty good, and then Josh Johnson continues to be that itch you can never scratch and whatnot. So, I mean, that's what it looks like over the last 5 years of the XFL. A little bit crazy. In the AAF, you got Dearness Johnson, the kickers, Young Hoku, Logan Woodside, John Wolford, that trifecta of QBs that included him and Garrett Gilbert for so many years. John Wolford still pushing. Daniel Brunskill, um, a reserve offensive lineman, and Alex Barrett still on the practice squad. So that's what it's going to look like as years go on. And is that considered an AAF success, 2020 XFL success? I don't know. I don't know who becomes the guy that kind of Tommy Maddox is their way, even though the 2001 XFL was a completely different animal. But
Mm-hmm.
as it comes down, um, this is what the final numbers look like. I know we had some NFL workouts with like the Andre Schmitz and everything like that, but Michigan kind of led the way this year. Any surprises as far as guys who have stuck around this long, anything like that as we wrap up, Greg? I know we're a little bit over time.
No, I mean, it's always interesting to see. I mean, what are the guys who are constantly in that workout cycle? And I know you and I both pay attention to that. Who's on the tryouts each and every week? There are certain consistencies, the guys that you see who are part of that cycle, and they're the guys on the periphery. They're the 54th man, to quote Dwayne the Rock Johnson, and there are always guys who, you think they should be the ones getting those workouts. You think they should be the ones who are trying out every Tuesday or Wednesday in the NFL, but they're not. So it's unfortunate that there aren't more opportunities for these UFL players, for these spring football players. I think as the league shows that it can stand on its own 2 feet, and this is not a fly by night operation, and they continue to move forward year after year after year, I'm hoping that coaches in the NFL see this as a great tool to bring players onto their rosters. I hope players see this as a legitimate opportunity for them to put work on tape that they can't do while they're on a practice squad, or they can't do while they're getting 3 reps every training camp practice. And so I think that's the ideal, right? We're looking at this from almost like the very early stages, right? And maybe that should be our expectation. This league is just forming. Spring football is just kind of beginning to stand on its own 2 feet. And maybe if we look at this in 5 or 10 years, the numbers will be exponentially higher because of the ecosystem that spring football has created and the trust that it has earned from players, agents, coaches, everybody who plays a role in getting these guys to spring football and then from spring football to the NFL.
Javon makes a good point as well. XFL legend PJ Walker is up there, and I did a
Mhm.
piece recently. I don't know if you saw, but it was like 17 members of the Argos won a Grey Cup ring that had spring football ties and whatnot.
Wow.
So, I mean, the opportunity is not only there for the NFL. There is sample size. There is data. Um, Very curious to see what the 2025 spring football season looks like. It is how many weeks away, I guess? I mean, once we start padding the numbers down, I think you saw that tweet I put out with roster sizes as well. I could
Uh-huh.
pull that up real quick, but it is it's exciting. I don't know if our level of just, you know, our level of just excitement is still where it's at. But like, I did this on November 26th. It was 41 of 64 for the Battlehawks, 31 of 64 for the Defenders, 30 of 64 for Arlington Roughnecks, 61 of 64. Brahmas 55 of 64, Birmingham 45 of 64, Showboats 25 of 64, and the Michigan Panthers are at 50. So plus 1 or 2 for each one of those teams. It's been about 2 weeks since I put that post out. So I mean, Brian, what we can get into this. I know we're kind of coming up on time here, but I mean, plenty of new guys coming in
Mhm.
to make their case. Obviously, we still have a lot of quarterbacks that haven't, made their commitments yet for the next
Yeah.
year. And overall, man, I'm excited.
Yeah.
I still have hope. Looking forward to it. I mean, we do these streams, the Marcast, all these other shows do their streams, and it does seem, even without putting the word expansion in the title, that people, a couple thousand people are still interested. I think we hit like 150, 160 people watching today, and I mean, there is interest here, and
Yeah.
hopefully in 5 years we see some more progress here. But Greg, thank you so much for chiming in. Obviously, one of the more knowledgeable people in this field, in this niche, and I'm just grateful to be able to have these conversations with you. Thank you so much, Greg.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be back with you, Pat, talking spring football, and hope to do it again soon.
Always, guys. You can find Greg Parks on Twitter. He does some great work on UFL board. I'll be tagging, and if you're new here, please like, share, subscribe. Get the word out about spring football. The more people are engaged, the more we're going to do this, and it's always a great time. But until then, guys, thank you. See you on the next one.